Well, I'm going to address this question to a young person, maybe not so young. So I move around here for a moment. Maybe this is a good direction to go. Your mom and dad ever send you to your room and tell you you needed an attitude adjustment? Yes? They're honest. What would be an example? What? Okay, you didn't do what they told you to do. You agree, Mother? Yeah? That doesn't happen a lot, though, right? No, thank God. I can see that. But we all know what it means to have an attitude adjustment. And I think that's a good image to describe a good deal of what we find in today's scriptures, especially our gospel, as you listen to it, because Jesus is addressing an attitude. And the first one is an attitude that needs correction. And who was that? Who was the first one? Who needed an attitudinal adjustment in the gospel? The Pharisee. All right, we're on a roll here. Maybe I move this direction. This will be good too. Both sides, both sides have cooperated. All right, the Pharisee. And he's contrasted with what is sometimes called a publican, but more accurately, a tax collector. All right? Now you know the story pretty well, but you know, it bears at least repeating a bit. The Pharisee takes up a position and said this prayer to himself: "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of human beings. Greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pay tithes on my whole income." Well, now those were good things. He fasts, he's generous, he pays tithes. What's the problem? It's his attitude. Proud, haughty, judgmental, critical. And what he has done by that attitude has blocked God's grace. He's formed a barrier between himself and God. God can't bless him because he's so full of himself, right? So obviously he's his own problem here with that attitude that he has. No room for God's love and grace because of his judgmental attitude. Well, then we're contrasted with this tax collector. Now, what do we know about the tax collectors at the time of Jesus? Why were they despised for the most part? They were greedy, they were dishonest, but even more importantly, they worked for the Romans. They hated Romans. They collected taxes for the hated Romans, you see, and then they also skimmed off the top for themselves. And of course, so they were not very well received in society at that time. So we can see Jesus using a tax collector here as an example, but he says the tax collector stood off at a distance and wouldn't even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus says he went home justified. And why? Because he opens his heart to God's love, to God's forgiveness, to God's grace. Whereas the Pharisee closed himself off. So obviously the Pharisee needed an attitudinal adjustment, okay? Well, okay, we come here today to celebrate the Holy Eucharist. And once again, Jesus comes into our lives through the power of the Scriptures, and we're asked the same question: do any of us need an attitudinal adjustment? Well, this isn't a time for public confession. You don't have to tell me, but I want you to think about it. What is your attitude? What is my attitude? Am I open to God's forgiveness and grace because of my humble stance? Now, when we deal with the issue of humility, we got to be a little careful here, Humility is closely allied to the virtue of truthfulness. They're both almost the same. A humble person acknowledges his gifts, his talents, his accomplishments, and so forth, but he always says it's because of God's grace, God's love, God's gift. I am what I am because of God's giftedness to me, my gifts, my talents, and so forth. A humble person acknowledges that everything is from God, and a humble person is therefore very generous, and we've preached about that already. They're grateful, they're generous, and other people are important in their lives, especially the poor and the needy, and those most in need of God's love. Whereas but a humble person also is aware of his or her needs. They're aware of growing edges. They're aware of their sins. They're aware of their faults, and they can acknowledge them too, and the need for God's forgiveness and grace. So a humble person is a truthful person about himself or herself, where a person who is not a humble person is not acknowledging the truth about themselves, you see? And again, form that block to God's grace, that barrier to God's grace in their lives. So today, that virtue of humility is lifted up once again for our reflection. Is it part of our lives? Do we need an attitudinal adjustment? If we do, what are we doing about it? If not, well, thank God. And let's continue to do the best we can so that we will certainly find ourselves among those who humble themselves, who will be exalted, and not with those who exalt themselves and who need to be humbled. It's our choice.